Good afternoon and a warm welcome from the IISS in London today for our webinar. I'm Nigel Davis, the Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia. This is the second of a double bill of webinars on the post-Soviet world in 2021. Yesterday featured Russia in 2021. The recording for that is already online if you'd like to see that and weren't present yesterday. Today we look at the rest of the former Soviet Union. 2020 was an exceptionally eventful year for the whole region, and not only for COVID. We had political upheaval after elections in Belarus and Kyrgyzstan, major conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, which marked the biggest change in the geopolitics of the region since Russia's annexation of Crimea and intervention in eastern Ukraine in 2014. There was also a significant election in Moldova. How will these developments shape the region in 2021, and what other events, issues, and trends should we watch? Or what surprises might await us? Our expert panel today will explore these and other questions. I will introduce them now. Tom Davao is a senior fellow for Carnegie Europe. He has written extensively on the Caucasus. I think if I recounted all of the books that he's written on this region, we wouldn't have much time for the webinar. But maybe I'll just draw attention to his most recent, The Caucasus, an Introduction, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Well then, Laruelle joins us from Russia today. She's director of the Institute for European, Russia and Eurasian Studies, the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. She is also a prolific author. Her latest book is Russian Nationalism, Imaginaries, Doctrines, and Political Battlefields, published by Routledge in 2018. Denis Sinusa is a political scientist from Moldova and a researcher at the Institute for Politikwissenschaft at the Justus Liebig University. He has written extensively on Moldova, EU affairs, and energy security. And Dr. Domitila Sagramoso is lecturer in security and development at the Department of War Studies, King's College London. She is an expert on security and conflict in Russia and Eurasia, and on Islamic radicalization in the North Caucasus. Her latest book is Russian Imperialism Revisited, From Disengagement to Hegemony, published by Routledge last year. So a warm welcome to our panel. I'd like to begin by asking each of them in turn, what are the most important one or two issues for the countries that you focus on over the coming year? What is it we should be looking for and have in our minds? Tom, can I start with you?
Yes, thank you, Nigel, and glad to be with you today and some colleagues I haven't seen for a while. You tell us, Nigel, how long you're expecting us to answer for. Just a few minutes.
Yeah, just a few minutes to get us going and aerate the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, absolutely. Just briefly, the South Caucasus has obviously been turned upside down by the Second Karabakh War, which lasted 44 days and ended in November. A deep, a kind of human tragedy with 7,000 lives lost, mainly young men on both sides who weren't alive even when the First Karabakh War was fought in the 1990s. A complete reversal of the situation, with the Armenians suddenly losing everything they pretty much gained in the 1990s, Azerbaijan now dominant, and also the introduction of a Russian peacekeeping force, Russia suddenly back in the region in a way it hasn't been for 30 years. So many questions and so few answers. I don't believe the actors themselves necessarily know what happens next. There's domestic turmoil in Armenia. There's a kind of consolidation now in Azerbaijan by President Aliyev, who suddenly has his legacy, but also faces quite a lot of challenges, economic challenges in particular. And Russia, suddenly owns the Karabakh problem, which gives it many new advantages, but also new vulnerabilities. And we shouldn't forget Georgia, which has looked rather nervously at what's happening to the south with a Russian peacekeeping force and new transport connections opening up, which look set to bypass Georgia, and also a Georgian parliament now sitting, which the opposition is boycotting, so some domestic instability in Georgia as well. But we should also say a good week for Georgia in the sense that Georgia, I think, will look fondly and have many expectations of the Biden administration for renewing quite a strong relationship with the US.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much. So a lot there to discuss later, the fallout from Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia's return to the region, but the uncertainty that you said faces all actors now, and of course the important point there about post-election developments in Georgia. Excellent. Marlene, what would be your candidates for the most important issue or two that we should have in our minds?
I think there are several issues. One is just at the political level, the forthcoming presidential election in Uzbekistan that we'll see, where we will be able to see how Mirziyoyev, who obviously will be re-elected, how he will be able to manage the campaign, to give the room to at least some symbolic opposition, how they will try to build Soviet results or not. So that will give us a lot about the tonality of the forthcoming years in terms of political reform in Uzbekistan. But more globally for the region, I would say the main challenges for the years to come is obviously the impact of the economic crisis linked to the pandemics, the states of migrants, because as you know, Central Asia is providing millions of migrants to Russia, and they have been really impacted by the pandemics and the closure of the borders and all the state dysfunctionality that got revealed during the crisis. But what I think makes it very specific for Central Asia is that in October, we had this revolution in or coup, depending how we want to interpret it, in Kyrgyzstan, and we recently got Sadir Japarov elected as the new Kyrgyz president, and is often presented as the Trump of Kyrgyzstan, but on many aspects is also the Putin of Kyrgyzstan, right? Someone that is saying that he will be a strong leader, reestablishing the dictator of law and order, and with a strong nationalist populist narrative. And I think that the key point is that people in Central Asia are pushing now for a strong leader, or therefore very often a nationalist and with a nationalist and populist narrative, because they hope for state efficiency. And I think that the key issue is how the regimes will be able to demonstrate a higher state efficiency than they have been so far. So that will be the case for Mirziyoyev. That will be the case, of course, for Japarov, and for Kazakhstan, where the Nazarbayev-Tokayev tandem is functioning, but not as well as probably it could be. That will be the key issue that people want to see, is that state efficiency. And if state efficiency is not delivered by the current political system, that will be a strong popular push, demand for a more strong leader, and therefore for a more populist type of leader.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much. A lot of leadership issues there. Then Mirziyoyev's re-election, maybe questions about how much further he'll continue his reforms. Japarov is both the Trump and the Putin of Central Asia. That's a remarkable combination. And then, yes, the tandem, whatever one might call it, the prospects for development of leadership in Kazakhstan, all, as you say, underlain by these larger questions of stateness. It's very, very interesting. Thank you. Denise, tell us about the key issues in Moldova that we should be focusing on now.
Yes, Moldova is very much in the same trend with other countries in the region that went through important political changes. The presidential elections of the last year brought to the presidency a new qualitatively new politician, Maya Sandu. She is a former leader of the Solidarity and Action Party, which raised from the ashes of anti-corruption mobilization of the population. She is the new president of the country, and she managed to win against a pro-Russian politician who was supported by Russia, but unsuccessfully for the presidential elections. And she is in a way very much interested in pushing for the reforms, especially in the rule of law area. But unfortunately, she is facing some institutional limitations because the country is a parliamentary republic, which means that the president has quite limited competences. So she is in need, in a very strategic need of a cooperative parliament and government. So therefore, now she is more successful on the foreign policy agenda, with her foreign policy agenda, where she's trying to create a kind of triangle together with Romania and Ukraine, promoting the European aspirations of Moldova and the agenda of Moldova in relations with the European Union. And the most complicated, though, issue on her political agenda will be the relationship with Russia, which already has criticized, including Putin during his latest public appearance, Maya Sandu's intention to continue the discussion about the withdrawal of Russian military forces from the Transnistrian region. So the relation with Russia and the Transnistrian conflict will be two very, very complicated issues that she will need to find solutions and allies in the West in order to go through.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much. So a very, very full agenda, both on domestic and foreign policy. As you say, the institutional limitations, maybe more elections, possibly parliamentary elections that will follow, implications of that, but also, yes, relations both with the EU and also with Russia. There's a lot of moving parts, it seems, there. Excellent. Domitila, so you're particularly interested in Russia's role in all of this and its relations with its neighbors. So what key issues do you think we should be focusing on?
Looking at the realities of the sort of the former Soviet space in the last year, I think one of the two elements which I think were relevant for Russia. One is, I think, a process of consolidation on the one hand of sort of the achievements of the past decades, and at the same time, a great effort at what I would call conflict management. I think this was really the sort of the word for Russia to address many of the crises that were mentioned by my colleagues, from the challenges ahead in terms of how to resolve the question of what is under Armenian control inside Karabakh, but with the protection of Russian peacekeepers. So the question of status, how can that be managed inside Karabakh? How the question, for example, of prisoner exchanges is managed, and of course, the more sensitive question of the various corridors, which are meant to be sort of patrolled by Russia, crossing Armenia and linking Karabakh, Azerbaijan with Turkey and Nakhichevan. So there is very sensitive questions that Russia will have to manage without alienating either sides, and at the same time ensuring that there is no further sort of chaos inside Armenia, as was mentioned, you know, these challenges of the internal dynamics in Armenia. At the same time, Russia had to address, of course, the challenges in Belarus, and the effort that to make sure that Belarus would not replicate a kind of orange or Euromaidan revolution as we had seen with Ukraine, and that again it would lose another sort of a former Soviet state with which it feels very closely aligned. From what we see now, it seems as though Lukashenko has at least in the short term managed to, I wouldn't say strengthen his power, but at least not lose it completely. And so this whole talk about his transition is now being delayed. There is going to be an assembly in February, but all this sort of timeline that Russia was really trying to impose or to push forward in Belarus is now being delayed in time, with a referendum in 2013 and a possible new constitution by 2025. So here we see more or less Russia at least succeeding in ensuring that that Belarus remains sort of anchored in the Russian sort of sphere of influence. Agreements on energy prices. Belarus had to agree to the demands of Russia in terms of oil and gas. And now another question in this respect is the transit of oil, for example, whether the refined oil will be delivered through Baltic ports or through Russian ports on the Baltic Sea. So here again, there is a question of whether Russia is going to succeed in, again, ensuring that its territory becomes an important transit route. Marlene talked very well about the crisis in Kyrgyzstan. So the only thing I want to say in that respect is that to a certain extent, Russia managed to make sure that there is a new leadership, which I don't think is going to take a sort of a non-Russian line. On the contrary, I think that the presence of Russian forces there is sort of guaranteed. And of course, the challenge remains Moldova, as was described by Dennis, and so I don't want to repeat on that, and sort of what will happen in the parliamentary elections and whether Russia is going to be able to influence through Dodon and his Socialist Party sort of the outcome. And also the extent to which I would argue there's going to be tension around Transnistria. It seems that my Russian colleagues constantly raise the specter that maybe there could be instabilities there or that Russia might sort of force a hand. So this is an area where I think we need to monitor very closely what is happening around Transnistria, how Russia will react to the demands of Maya Sandu that the Russian forces are withdrawn, and this was done interestingly in Kiev. So the new sort of strong alignment with Ukraine, I think, is also a very interesting one. And I think that here Russia might be quite worried and also a bit frustrated around the sort of the lack of progress around the Donbass. I think that it's clear that the Minsk agreement is not going to be accepted by the Ukrainian population. That the hopes that there would be sort of a significant breakthrough with Zelensky haven't really materialized. Zelensky is sort of much more aligned to the West than maybe Russia was hoping initially. And here I would argue that the area to be looking at carefully are issues, of course, around the Donbass, but also the Sea of Azov and potential instabilities there with a transit of Ukrainian vessels who may find it very difficult because of the bridge and because of the checks often carried out by the Russian military. So I think I'm going to stop now and open the floor, but I'm very happy to go more into depth into many of these points.
Excellent, thank you. What you bring out very clearly is the range of opportunities and challenges facing Russia in the region now. Opportunities in places like well, with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia and Azerbaijan, where it seems to be Russian diplomacy has done rather well in the latter phases of those developments, but also challenges and potentially setbacks as well, and difficulties to manage in Belarus and Moldova as well, and as you say, frustrations in respect of Ukraine too. Much for Russia to think about. Tom, if I could just come back to you. You made the striking remark that even the actors in the aftermath of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict may not really have a clear sense of what will happen next. So does that mean that the situation itself is fluid? There might be a resumption of hostilities, or are we in what's more clearly, at least for now, a post-conflict phase that will evolve in non-violent ways? Can I sort of press you on your best guess about what might happen next?
Yes. Sorry, can you hear me? My connection isn't very good. So yes, let me know if I need to turn off my picture. Yes, I mean, it is, what we have in Nagorno-Karabakh is a ceasefire and an agreement on transport corridors and the deployment of a peacekeeping force. What we don't have is a peace agreement. And any agreement on status. And so I think everyone is really feeling their way around this new realities. I think Armenia is very much in denial about what happened. Their whole project of the last 30 years almost has come crashing down, and they're trying to salvage what they can, and there's a lot of domestic recriminations. And I think Prime Minister Pashinyan is very much focused on defending his own position a bit more than pursuing options in Karabakh. As for Azerbaijan, I think they're almost kind of dizzy with victory and still pursuing quite an aggressive line vis-a-vis the Armenians. But again, we're not quite sure what President Aliyev does next. He's also, I think, doing some domestic squabbling with parts of the opposition now that he's got extra legitimacy. But I think what's really uncertain is the situation inside Karabakh itself and what the Russians are up to. So the Russians are kind of now, they've never owned this conflict, and they've always been a kind of important external actor, as distinct to their role, their active role supporting one side or the other in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, Ukraine. They've always been an external actor. Now they're in, and with kind of stakes on both sides in a kind of balancing role. So they have a kind of agenda which I think is being pursued by the Defense Ministry to consolidate themselves on the ground in Karabakh, to be almost running the show, to be running the health system, almost to be replacing the authorities there, to be digging in, and possibly even rumors that they might be considering handing out Russian passports, as they've done in Abkhazia or South Ossetia. On the other hand, they have to consider Azerbaijan. They have to consider also the fact that there's a 5-year window on this peacekeeping mandate, which that isn't the case, obviously, in any of the other situations. So they have to bargain with Azerbaijan and keep Azerbaijan happy. And they've also got the Azerbaijani agenda, which is about opening transport corridors, and particularly this transport corridor across, connecting Azerbaijan with its exclave of Nakhchivan, from which it's been separated for 30 years via Armenia. So actually, Russia's kind of facing both ways, and we're seeing, depending which day you are, you see a slightly different Russia on this conflict. You see Sergei Lavrov saying we have to continue the international process, we have to continue negotiations, and then the Defense Ministry rather aggressively doubling down on the ground. So we're seeing, I think, disjunctions within Russian policy as well. And then you've got the Turkey angle as well. I think the Turks expected to get a lot more out of this than they did. I think President Erdogan probably feels that he was promised a mixed peacekeeping force, and then that got successively downgraded as the facts emerge. So we have yet to see whether the Turks are happy with the fact that they thought that they'd ensured the Azerbaijani victory, that they'd broken up the Minsk group, and that they were now inside this conflict, and they've rather been marginalized since the ceasefire in November. And then just to add one extra thing, the US is suddenly, I think, wants to be back in the region. Look at the new foreign policy team in Washington. A lot of them have Caucasus experience. And the US is a co-chair, which has been pretty much seeing in action for the last four years on this issue. They're very much been marginalized, but they will want to do something, and it remains to be seen what. But again, a rather tricky game to play, because this, where you're basically facing off against Russia in so many other situations, in this situation, you are kind of in an uneasy partnership with Russia, which is quite difficult to handle. So sorry, many more questions than answers, but I'm just trying to, maybe I'm admiring the problem, but it could go in I hope I'm clear that it could go in many different ways this year.
No, thank you. You've mapped out the complexity of the problem, I think, wonderfully clearly. You also remind us, of course, one of the larger contextual points for the whole region this year is the new administration in Washington, and how that might bear on developments in all of these countries. And certainly one takeaway for me from this webinar will be the question, what is Russia up to in Nagorno-Karabakh, and is Russia fully internally joined up on this? In fact, that's absolutely fascinating. Wonderful. Marlene, may I return to your remarks about Uzbekistan? Now, you drew attention to the coming presidential election. It sounded like you didn't have any great doubt about the outcome of that. But if we look at the trajectory of Uzbekistan in recent years, of course, it's been a very interesting one and encouraging under this president. Do you see prospects that that reform agenda, that momentum, will continue? And if so, in what directions and with what implications?
Well, I think in terms of foreign policy, reopening the country to regional cooperation, I think on that, this reforming move or mood will continue, and that's one of the very strong points of the Mirziyoyev administration. I think economically also the reforms are continuing to be developed, maybe at a lower pace, but they are still there, and I think there is a real will from the governments to try to improve the economic situation by liberalizing. The big issues, of course, is at the political level, and here the political reforms we have seen have been so far very superficial, right? You cannot really say that you have organized political opposition, that you have that the parliament is a very efficient and autonomous institution. There have been small improvement into the independence of the judicial system, but it's still very limited. So I think the real issue is, of course, will these reforms go not only in the economic side, but also move to the political one? And I would be quite reluctant in thinking that Uzbekistan is moving toward any kind of democratization. What is sure is that the pressure at the society level has been diminishing very clearly. And so for people, it's really easier to kind of organize themselves with less fear, launch new projects with less pressure from the state. Culturally, the country is really developing. The higher education system is entirely in the process of getting reshaped. So a lot of things are happening, but of course the political reform are not there, because that would be very rare for an authoritarian regime to suddenly decide by itself to open up to opposition.
Excellent, thank you. Can I just press you also on the fallout from the emphatic election victory of Japarov in Kyrgyzstan? What do you think he will want to do with this power that he's now acquired?
Yeah, so he has been moving back Kyrgyzstan into a presidential regime, and you may remember a few years ago, Kyrgyzstan was, I think, alone with Moldova in being more a parliamentary democracy than a presidential regime, and now the pendulum is going back to the presidential regime, which I think is totally understandable in the Kyrgyz case, because as I said, people imagine or think that a strong leader and a leader with strong power will be able to improve state efficiency and especially to cope with the economic impact of the current crisis, which probably is illusory, but that's how it is projected by many of the citizens. So I think one of the big issues will be to see the level of presidentialism that Japarov will be really trying to develop. Will that be a kind of soft authoritarianism, or will that be a strong one, like really getting more and more power and beginning eliminating the opposition? And the other challenging that he will have to, or that we will have to look at, will be to see if what was supposed to be his connection to the criminal underground world will be really revealed and kind of showing that all these underground shadowy economy scheme are kind of controlling the regime and how it is functioning. So I think the years will be really interesting to see how he will be building his power and hope and able or not to share it with part of its opposition.
So that potentially a recasting of the way that power works, the way the institutions work in Kyrgyzstan, which I'm not sure we've seen there in recent times. Very, very, very significant. Thank you. Denise, now you mentioned coming parliamentary elections in Moldova, and also I think Constitutional Court has been active too. So what are the implications of domestic developments for Sandu's own power and capacity to push forward her agenda? Can you say more about what you described as the institutional restraints that are active there?
Yes, you're right. She is going to face the reality, and the reality is quite harsh at home, because her political party in the current parliament is quite weak. They have only 15 MPs out of 100 of total seats. So, which means that ideally she would like to trigger the early elections as soon as possible and to capitalize on her own success during the presidential elections of last year in order to increase the weight of her political party. And at the same time, if she fails to have the elections as soon as possible, then the game could be turning against her, because she was projecting a lot of expectations at home that she's going to provide reforms that will satisfy citizens, and those reforms are particularly related to the fighting of corruption, but also obviously the anti-pandemic recovery, economic recovery, and so on and so forth. So she has a multitask right now, and that's why she is in a rush to decide which option she should choose, because she has quite limited maneuvering space. On the one hand, she can appoint the prime minister, but that prime minister could be accepted by the current composition of the parliament, which means that the early elections are not taking place soon enough. And another option would be to actually risk and go further, waiting for the for a different scenario, which will make her less criticized by the population, because she tries to transfer the responsibility toward the Russian forces and the idea that they are those which are impeding the quick solutions, political solutions for the current political crisis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just to press you on foreign policy now, could you say more about the Transnistria problem or issue, and how the Sandu administration might seek to develop its own policy towards that?
Maya Sandu has a predictable policy and approach toward the conflict settlement, but it's not ambitious. She didn't present any roadmap, specific roadmap about the way she sees the improvement, the facilitation of the settlement. But she's relying very much on the international formats and the OSCE. So she's not going to make any quick and not well thought movement, because she understands that behind the Transnistrian conflict is actually Russia. So she's trying to really shield herself from the counter reactions from the Russian side, and bring more into the discussion the 5+2 format of the conflict settlement, the international commitments that Russia made in 1999 about the withdrawal of the forces and of the military capacities from the region. So she is really bringing a lot of this understanding that the multilateralism and international community, in particular the US and the EU, should be at the forefront, and because they have more political weight, and they can even participate further in the confidence building measures between the two borders of the Dniester River, which is costly, and Moldova doesn't have these resources. So she is quite intelligent in trying to keep the international players in solving the issue.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, very clear. Thank you very much. Domitila, may I just take up some of your earlier remarks? So you of course, discussed the situation in Belarus currently, and also you mentioned Russia's frustrations with respect to Ukraine. So it wouldn't want a Maidan or an Orange Revolution in Minsk, and it faces some frustrations in Ukraine. So can you just give us a sense of what instruments, what means you think Russian policy might try to use to influence or manage those situations, and how effective are those likely to be?
Thank you. I mean, this is a very interesting question, because it brings us to, how Russia operates in the former Soviet space, and what is really Russia trying to achieve. And if I may go back a few steps and then address exactly your question, I think that first of all, it's important to mention that I think that a lot of the focus of Russia will be on the domestic aspects, the transition, potentially of power and questions of economic, emergency, and overall internationally the relationship with the United States. So I think that sort of the so-called lands in between, Belarus, Ukraine, developments there and how Russia operates. They should be seen within this broader context of how, for example, the Biden administration is going to operate in Ukraine in particular, what is going to happen again with Belarus. Are we going to see again an opening of the kind that we saw with Pompeo when he visited Belarus last year and offered sort of alternative sources of energy to Belarus? I think that what is interesting to note, first of all, is that I think talk about Russia, there's always this question about whether Russia wants to sort of restore the former Soviet Union in a new shape or form. I think that is something that we really shouldn't worry too much about. It's sort of an ideal objective, but I don't think that this is something that will materialize. Everybody understands very clearly that this goal is really impossible. So what Russia really tries to achieve, in my view, is to create a very strong network of alliances, and it operates bilaterally or multilaterally through instruments like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Shanghai Fora, or the Eurasian Economic Union. But of course, its actions have limitations. And to your question specifically of what instruments it can use, for example, in the case of Belarus, was a strong ally. Russia has a very important sort of economic tool it can utilize, because the Belarusians, the economic mechanisms and the system depends very much on low oil and gas prices. So any negotiation around oil and gas, it was reached very recently, to a certain extent gives Russia quite a strong leverage. Also, Belarus relies very much on the Russian market for the export of its own products, which are not very competitive in the West and on other global markets. So Russia really on the economic front with Belarus has very important sort of tools that it can play with. And of course, it also internationally, it became very supportive to a certain extent of the Lukashenko regime by not pushing forward for a very open or immediate retreat or exit of Lukashenko from power. And I think this is something that Lukashenko in some way has to consider and to a certain extent pay back. So his multi-vector foreign policy is very limited, also due to the fact that Belarus cannot really turn to the West now. And its reliance on sort of political support from Russia alienated many in the Belarusian population, which were not necessarily anti-Russian, but now Lukashenko is identified as a president that relies very much on Russian support politically and potentially also from the security forces, not the military so much, but the security, what is sort of all the Siloviki structures, which have become or shown to be very reliable and in support of Lukashenko. In Ukraine, the situation is a lot more complex because as we usually said, Russia, won Crimea, but lost Ukraine to a certain extent. Of course, there are constituencies in Ukraine that are more favorable to close ties with Russia, and there are these sort of pro-Russian parties, the inheritors of the Yanukovych Party of Regions, the groups around United Ukraine or Medvedchuk. So Russia can utilize these political figures or political parties. This is something it doesn't really have in Belarus, and that is why it was pushing so much for a transformation of the constitutional arrangement, so that there could be a parliament, for example, where elements within Belarus could be sort of more pro-Russian, and there could be space for alternative parties. So in Ukraine, the advantage that maybe Russia has and can use is that it has political figures, political constituencies that are not so anti-Russian, that have a similar outlook about, for example, the historical narrative of the Second World War, that would like to speak Russian. And the language question, I think, is one of those that we need to monitor very much, because Ukraine is really pushing forward with a sort of an enforcement of the Ukrainian language. And that creates problems, especially in those regions that are in a majority sort of Russian speaking and in the big cities. So I think that the final instrument that I think there are two instruments that Russia can use. One is sort of the military one, the pressure it can put along the coasts of Ukraine and also in the Donbass, the potential to sort of again hype certain sectors of the Ukrainian population, and of course the energy tool, which is a very important question around what will happen with Nord Stream. If a Nord Stream doesn't really move forward, that leaves Russia to a certain extent reliant on transit of its gas, around 65% through Ukraine. Instead, if we have Nord Stream moving forward, which I think is not very likely at the moment, then the levers of influence of Russia are more limited, because it creates, this sort of asymmetric dependency again becomes sort of reinforced if a lot of the gas transits through Ukraine. I hope I answered a lot of your points. It's a very broad topic.
You convey a very complex and comprehensive picture extremely well. And what's clear is that Russia still has a great deal of much more than residual influence and ways of trying to exert influence and manage the direction of change in a number of its countries, although with no guaranteed success. And you drew attention, of course, to the setbacks it's faced in Ukraine. And your point about the constitutional changes in Belarus are very interesting. And we'll have to see whether that's simply sort of misdirection by Lukashenko, whether it's something that is being implemented there under Russian pressure for Russian purposes, or what. There's a lot to discuss there. We have some time for questions now. There are two ways that you can ask a question if you'd like to do so. One is to raise your hand if you'd like to ask it in your own voice and be called upon. If you're happy to ask it on your behalf, then please type it into the Q&A box, and I'll get through as many as I can. So we have several questions already. And here's one from an old colleague of mine, Craig Oliphant. And he has a question about Georgia. So probably that's one for you, Tom. He says, following the October elections and the opposition boycott of parliament that you mentioned, could you comment on the recent announcement that Bidzina Ivanishvili is retiring from Georgian politics? And what are the implications for that? And he has a follow-up for anyone else who wishes to take it up. What are the larger lessons that other countries in the region might draw from the developments in Nagorno-Karabakh? But let's start with you, Tom, on that Georgia-specific question.
Right. Well, as we know, I think Bidzina Ivanishvili is possibly the most extraordinary politician I think I can think of in the post-Soviet space. He really is in a category of his own, Georgia's richest man, who sort of has dramatically intervened in Georgian politics and is the patron of the ruling party, and was prime minister once, then went away, came back as head of the ruling party, has this extraordinary personal feud with former President Mikhail Saakashvili, a rather unhealthy feud, I think, as most Georgia watchers would probably agree, with these two larger-than-life personalities dominating Georgian politics. So his announcement that he's going to withdraw again from Georgian politics, I think, has to be met with a certain amount of skepticism. I think he probably, one half of him genuinely doesn't want to be a frontline person in Georgian politics. He would rather be, with his art collection and his tree collection and his extraordinary menagerie in Western Georgia. On the other hand, I have no doubt that he will find reasons to be dragged back in, and also various friends of his, even relatives of his, are fairly influential in Georgian politics. I'm afraid a lot of business gets done personally with him on the telephone. So I would like to think that this is a sign in which this informal political leader does leave the scene, and Georgia is actually, the Georgian government is actually governed by the people that we see by day on its TV screens. But we have to be a little skeptical. But I guess one other point is that perhaps Mr. Ivanishvili doesn't really want to take much responsibility for what is not a good situation in Georgia at the moment. There's the political problem, but there's also an economic problem. Georgia put a lot of its bets on tourism as the salvation for its economy in the last few years. That seemed a good bet until the pandemic pretty much wiped out the whole of last year's tourists. And it's really not clear whether it's going to get back on its feet this year. Georgia did very well in the early phase of the pandemic the last year, but is now has one of the highest per capita rates now, unfortunately, in the world, certainly in Europe. So Georgia really struggling. So that could indeed be a reason that Mr. Ivanishvili, when tough decisions have to be made, decides to leave the scene and will only come back if things look a bit easier.
Excellent, thank you. Does anyone want to fill the second part of Craig's question? So what other countries in the region will be thinking and responding, what lessons they'll be drawing from Nagorno-Karabakh? Anyone like to look at that? Domitilla, maybe one for you? Would you like to unmute, please?
I'm happy to speak, but I also want to give Dennis, I don't know if he wants to go first and then I go myself.
All right,
if you're after you.
Yes, okay, thank you. I'm going to leave Moldova to Dennis, and I'm going to talk about Ukraine in particular. It's very interesting that recently we saw the visit of the OSCE delegation headed by the Swedes diplomat Anne Linde, where she was in Kiev telling the Ukrainian government very clearly not to learn any wrong lessons from Azerbaijan's incursion into Karabakh. And I think that what is interesting is that during those times, there was talk that the Turks or the Ukrainians were trying to get support from Turkey in terms of drones to see if they could potentially carry out a similar operation. Also, what is interesting is that there is this sort of international platform for the return of Crimea to Ukraine, which was set up last year, so as not to forget about Crimea. And there is a sort of concern that Ukraine might decide that its armed forces may be ready to carry out some kind of military operation. The OSCE very clearly saying, you know, be really careful, do not engage in any military adventure. But I think that if you listen to some of the declarations of some of the military figures in Ukraine, there is constant talk about engaging in war with Russia, which I was looking at yesterday. I was really quite surprised. This idea that they somehow could get into a victorious war with Russia. I think the scenario would be extremely different, you know, the Donbass to Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think that there is a risk very much that the wrong lessons are learned. And this a bit reminds me of what had happened in 2008 in Georgia after those events. I was in Karabakh and in Armenia and Azerbaijan the year later. And there was a perception that in Azerbaijan that the lesson they learned was that they had to carry this military operation successfully. And they waited over 10 years until they actually managed. So I think that we have to think in the long term, not necessarily this year or next year, but maybe in a 10 years you know, scenario where they prepare for these kind of actions when one is least expecting it. I think that I'll give the floor to Dennis on Moldova. What I can say from the Russian point of view on Moldova is that there is a lot of concern that this can happen. I don't think it will, but what really surprised me is how often my Russian colleagues mention concerns that the Moldovans might operate more actively in Transnistria. And they also saw very negatively the first visit of Maya Sandu was to Ukraine, and that she mentioned this famous word, you know, Slava Ukraina, that really sort of, I'm just voicing the concerns of Russians, not necessarily agree with them, but just to show that in Moscow there is a lot of concern of what is going to happen around Transnistria, and the fact that militarily it's very hard to defend and protect as opposed to the Donbass.
Excellent. Dennis, would you like to comment on this? And I'll add another question that has just come in from Sebastian Izaro, who asks, what would be a viable solution for Transnistria? It's a challenge to answer either of those questions concisely, but it would be very, very good to hear your thoughts on them. Thank you.
Thank you. Moldovan elite, none of the political parties that are now represented in the parliament and those which are outside the parliament is promoting any kind of militaristic approach toward the conflict in Transnistria. There is no interest in actually creating tensions, artificial tensions with the separatist administration. There are many reasons for that, but the main idea is that both Maia Sandu and the others are understanding that the most viable solutions are only peaceful and through the international players. And at the same time, objectively speaking, the Transnistrian army and the police and the special forces intelligence is much more prepared to fight than actually the Moldovan side. We have different estimates that show that their army is better prepared for a potential military conflict, and at the same time, interestingly, we have situations when people are kidnapped by the separatist authorities. They simply drive to Chisinau or to any other place in Moldova on the constitutional side, and they sequestrate people, and then they bring them to Tiraspol and organize trials on them. More than that, we also have people who are working in state institutions in Moldova who have citizenship of the Transnistrian region and which are potentially risky people, dangerous people, because they may transfer sensitive information to Tiraspol. So I'm not sure that anybody who understands the real proportion of powers between Tiraspol and Chisinau is really thinking about any adventure with militaristic approach behind. The general idea is to keep up the dialogue and to look for diplomatic solutions, which will include obviously reintegration of the country.
Right. Excellent. Reintegration, and again to Sebastian's question, what might that look like, or how might it be achieved?
There is only one thing that is clearly said by the pro-EU forces, political forces, that no federalization of the country should take place. So this is a non-solution for the settlement of the conflict. And at the same time, even the Transnistrian region, the elites, local elites, they don't want that. They want the independence of the region and future joining to Russia. A sort of exclave like we have in the Baltic region. So nobody is really interested in organizing federalization apart from pro-Russian forces represented by the former president of the country, Igor Dodon, and maybe some elites in Moscow. But in general, there is an understanding that Moldova has quite a lot of problems with the region. There is a growing debt that the region is creating by not paying for gas that it consumes and its economy is using to produce manufacturing, and all those debts will be counted as Moldovans. So therefore, the solution of the conflict is quite multifaceted, and it includes also a lot of money, billions of dollars that Moldova will need to find in order to really make as smooth as possible the reintegration of the country.
Excellent, thank you. Jonathan Isle has raised his hand. Jonathan, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Nigel. Thanks for the two webinars of yesterday and today. Excellent work. I mean, it could be argued, and some Western governments have argued, that Mr. Putin has changed his tactic. and that now he's happy or more relaxed to see political change taking place in particular countries, that he wants his influence to remain valid, on the good understanding that at the end of the day, these countries would discover that they can't escape from the Russian embrace. You could argue that that is what happened in Armenia and that the Russian gamble succeeded. And you could argue that this is what is likely to happen in both Belarus and Moldova. So I think my question is more to Dionys Genusha, which is to say, isn't the real risk for Maya Sandu that she's placing too much hope in what she could get out of the West and perhaps too little in what she could get from her immediate neighbors, namely Ukraine and Romania?
Okay, Dennis, over to you.
Yes, the question is pertinent. That the reason why basically Maya Sandu focused first of all on her neighbors, Russia, Romania and Ukraine. The idea is that Romania can provide and is providing already support even during the COVID pandemic. Romania was one of the most generous supporter of Moldova, supplying it with medicine, with drugs, masks, and many other things, including President of Romania promised, being in Chisinau, that he's going to make sure that Romania is also helping with the vaccination of Moldova through giving some lots of vaccines that it receives itself from the European side. So on the one hand, Romania is an important partner, and at the same time, Ukraine is very it's a crucial one as well, because Ukraine is playing a huge role in cross-border management cooperation with Moldova, and it can stop smuggling and many other illicit activities that take place at the border with Ukraine. So therefore, one of the priority of Maya Sandu in her political agenda was exactly to rebuild and to strengthen the dialogue with the Bucharest and Kiev, and at the same time make sure that these two players are in a way supporting her and giving her this kind of geopolitical weight against potential reactions or actions from the Russian side.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question here from James Casey, who asks, with the Biden administration attempting to increase support for Georgia, is there a risk of Russia tightening its grip on South Ossetia and Abkhazia even further? I suppose I might say it's very substantial dependence already, but could we put the question more broadly? Could we see a change in Russian policy in or towards Georgia? Tom.
I think it's a very pertinent question. I think we have to separate very much Abkhazia and South Ossetia. South Ossetia, which is a willing partner of Russia, which actually wants to be united with North Ossetia and join Russia. This is very much the will of the small South Ossetian elites, a very small population there. And despite much of the population having links with Georgia, is interested in isolating itself from Georgia. Very different situation in Abkhazia, where they've always wanted to try and more of a balancing game, rely on Russia, but also keep up international links, keep the border open with Georgia for certain connections. Last year, actually, they willingly accepted a lot of assistance from WHO, UNDP across the border with Georgia. Unfortunately, that window seems to have closed a bit with in Abkhazia. Unfortunately, I think the Georgian authorities, may, for various reasons, didn't really pick up the signals for a kind of rapprochement with Abkhazia in the last year. And now we've got the Russians, I think, again, moving in a bit more strongly, passing legislation to harmonize legislation between Abkhazia and Russia. And we've got an energy crisis in Abkhazia at the moment, because the Inguri power station, which serves both, which is on the border between Abkhazia and Western Georgia, serves both Abkhazia and actually the whole of Georgia, is shut for repairs. And there's a big energy crisis in Abkhazia as a result of that. They've never learned how to pay for their own electricity. And I think Russia will use that, unfortunately, to try and get its get a tighter grip on Abkhazia, which is a shame, because I think that there are smarter ways of continuing engagement with Abkhazia.
Excellent, thank you. So we're coming up to the end of our time. There's maybe time for one more question. I'm going to roll together a number that have been asked that essentially touch on the same issue, which is, and it's a bridge between our webinar yesterday and today. So when Russia views developments in the region now, how is it thinking and feeling? Is there a danger of overstretch? Do they worry that overall their hegemony in, if we can still call it that, in the wider region is in retreat? Is there a larger single narrative? Was it just too complicated for that? Marlene, would you like to comment both with respect to Central Asia, but perhaps more generally?
Yeah, happy to. Well, I think what is important for Russia, that what Russia realized is how much it's difficult, in fact, to keep its, sorry for the phone ringing, how it's difficult for Russia to keep its position overall in the region. Russia is losing more country than it is winning. And so those who remain kind of friendly to Russia are kind of diminishing, right? It's mostly Central Asia now that and Belarus, but Belarus is a complicated case. And even in Central Asia, we can see the rise of a new generation of social activists that are more and more critical toward Russia and accusing it of being a colonial power. So I think on many aspects, Russia is kind of, reaching its maximum in terms of prestige, in terms of influence. And I think we have to dissociate economically, of course, especially for Central Asia, it's China winning with the Belt and Road Initiative, even if the population there is a growing xenophobia also. But at the geopolitical level, in terms of strategic cooperation, it's still Russia leading in Central Asia through the CSTO. So I think it depends on the country and on the sectors, but globally, yes, we can say that the Russian influence seems to have kind of reached its maximum. The Eurasian Economic Union has kind of stopped really developing as a meaningful political project or even economic project for those who are a member. And so now it's a kind of, at the best, a stagnation, at the worst, a kind of diminishing of influence.
Thank you. Domitilla, again, you look across the region and at the Russian role in many of the countries here. Anything to add to Marlene's arguments?
No, I fully agree. I think that Russia, as I said at the beginning, Russia, I think, is trying to consolidate. I don't think that it's trying to push much further, but I think that it will try by all means to retain the influence that it has achieved in many regions, not just in Central Asia, but also in the sort of western parts of the former Soviet Union and in the South Caucasus. I think it is aware of its limitations, the rise of course, of powers like China, the growing influence of Turkey in Azerbaijan, Western sort of engagement and very strong involvement in Ukraine and potentially also in Moldova. It's very concerned about a potential turn of Belarus westwards, which cannot be completely sort of discarded. So I think that Russia is aware that it can't really push forward with much stronger integration, but I think it would be a mistake to underestimate the relevance of these institutions. For example, if you look at the Eurasian Economic Union, it was an organization which to a certain extent really forced countries to adopt, for example, Russia's external tariffs. So these became the common external tariffs of all countries. And that created problems in trade in Central Asia. For example, for Kyrgyzstan, which used to be a sort of an important transit country for Chinese products. So I think that it still has a certain relevance, and I think an area which is also important to look at is sort of the entire energy complex, and to what extent Russia has managed to acquire assets, transit pipelines. And to what extent countries have also managed to diversify away. I mean, Georgia is interesting how it managed to diversify away from Russia in terms of gas. Moldova, now again, relying more on Romania, Ukraine, also diversifying away. So I think that, you know, as I said in one of my previous talks, I think Russia, to a certain extent, is an aspiring hegemon. It tries to achieve hegemony. It exerts it in some areas, but it is not always entirely successful. And going back to Marlene's work, which I learned a lot from, so I'm very glad to have you here in the panel. This whole narrative of the Russian world, I think, has started, you know, with a big bang, but I don't think it really managed to penetrate and to be an effective sort of catchword or an idea that could, you know, reintegrate many of these countries. So I think what the problem is that there is a lack of a common project where everybody can identify. It's more a very transactional relationship of Russia with many of these countries. And each one of them is trying to get the best of what they can, but there isn't a sense of community anymore. And I think I'm going to stop here and don't want to take more time.
Excellent, excellent. Very, very, very rich and concludes a very rich and varied discussion. I'll just finish with a thought that this year marks the 30th anniversary of the breakup of the Soviet Union. We still call the region the post-Soviet space, in effect defining the present in terms of the past. I know that some people, including within the region, are unhappy with that, and perhaps with a good reason, Freudian slip. Maybe there's time to find another term of art, but much more to discuss. So perhaps we should have a dedicated event on the 30th anniversary. In the meantime, we have another event at this time next Friday at 4 o'clock on the North Caucasus. So please come to that. And for now, I'd like to thank our silent but omnipotent Tom in IT for making this event possible, and our panelists. So Tom, Marlene, Dennis, and Domitila for a really outstanding serving up of a feast of intellectual fare, which has given us much to think about. And thanks to our audience for your excellent questions. I'm sorry you couldn't get to all of them, and for coming to today's event. See you at the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.